Welcome back and thank you for being here with us today. So, I have questions for you that will be rhetorical. I'm not going to ask you to answer them. So, just bear with me if you could for a second. So, how do we live out the Christian values of truth, justice, reparation, retribution, and reconciliation in this community? How do we live them out? The second question is, as a Christian community, what is our attitude towards the manipulation and misleading of information from the real truth? And last but not least, are we responsible for the misfortune of our neighbors? Are we? So let me put you a little context. Today is called the fourth disclosure in chapter 18 of Matthew, focusing on community matters. The believers, we believe, and not me, but the scholars believe that this is a catechesis teaching us conflict resolution. Have you ever heard of that before? Raise your hand if you have. If you have, raise your hand. Conflict resolution, have you heard about that before? In the church? No? Not in the church? Okay. So this is what is this called? Conflict resolution thing. Teaching. It goes on to give a glimpse of the early faith community dealt with the painful issues and determined when the sin becomes disruption that requires decisive actions. In other words, when the trouble gets too bad into the community, we need to do something about it. The gospel is giving us three little things on how to handle an issue, right? You can tell them to me by reading the gospel, right? The first thing is talk one-on-one. The second one is taking witnesses with you. And the third is take the whole church as a council, and you then can resolve. But the focus is not a punitive focus. Remember, the early church, when you committed a sin, there was not the right of reconciliation like we have now in the Book of Common Prayer. Confessions of sins in the early church were in public. So imagine me committing a sin and confessing that to you in public, and you giving me the absolution needed for my sin. Does it make sense? Now, Jesus is teaching that. The Book of Common Prayer keeps the rubrics on it. If you go into the Book of Common Prayer and look for the rubrics for reconciliation rites, you will notice that there is one little clause in there that says, if the priest notices the one person is sinning or is doing things that are not according to the moral character of the Christian church, he needs to report that to the bishop immediately in writing. After doing so, I have to inform the person that I am no sharing communion with him or to her because of the notorious sins. Do you know that? Do you know that? Yes? No? All right. I'm going to say what I did when about a year and a half ago, and I said to you, in my country we say yes like this, or we say no like that, okay? You don't have to use words. Come on. So did you know that? Some of you do, some of you don't. Okay, fine. So Matthew is trying to reflect on his community and all the divisions that they were in, and they were having a lot of trouble. But his teaching today is focused on teaching us something very powerful. First and foremost, this is not a punitive or a judicial trial. At any point into this particular catechesis or discipline, Matthew is asking us to have a jury and to excommunicate somebody right away. The focus is to save that person, the transgressor, the one is committing something wrong, to come back to the community and not to leave. And yet, what he doesn't want us to do is to keep silence. In other words, if we keep silence, it's as the same as supporting the sinner. Make sense? Make sense? All right. So, clearly those three steps are being followed by communities and by the Episcopal Church and by many others. But Matthew is making two teachings that I think I'd like to focus today on. The first one is troubles and problems are always be part of the community. Don't you think? Criticism, gossiping, judging. All of that takes place where? In the church. In the church. I remember my professor of theology one Sunday when this gospel was on, and his open line was, where do you think the devil likes to live the best? What is the best place that he likes to live? Yes, and we didn't know. We were so naive as seminarians, and we said, well, maybe a bar, maybe Las Vegas, or maybe, all those places that you are considered as sin places, but yet he loves to be in the church. Why? Because he's not happy about us coming in closer to Jesus, right? So what he's trying to do? Speaks on our ears, right? And says, I don't like that. So Matthew and Jesus are being saying to us that what we need to keep under control is to have chaos in the community. Make sense? So problems will come in and will be part of us. Yes? There will always be somebody who speaks more, like me, big mouth. There always will be a person judging or criticizing. There always will be problems in the church. We cannot avoid that. We tried for many years, but we have been very successful about it as a whole church. Now, perhaps Matthew was a good Episcopalian because he is trying to portray to us an alternative, right? The middle ground. In other words, keep it under control, but yet allow people to be sinners because, after all, we are sinners. And we're going to keep doing the same things if we don't want to grow personally and individually. So the second thing Matthew wants to teach us is the goal is reconciliation, restoration, and retribution. Now, when we call about forgiveness or forgiving somebody, we need to make sure that we understand that as we are forgiving somebody, we are not asking that person to kneel in front of us. We are asking for that person to show retribution, reparation. How do you repair that whatever you have done wrong? How do you repair that? In the time of Jesus, there was one man who did a wonderful reparation. His name was Nicodemus. He was taking away money from somebody else, right? When Jesus comes to his house, what is the first thing he says? Whatever I have steal from anybody else, I will reimburse them, or I'll give back to them what? 4 times what I've taken from them. So reparation is something that I do out of mercy, out of love. Because after all, within this gospel, what is present the most is love. Unconditional love. The love that forgives. Parents will know this better because when we are parents, no matter what the sin of our children is, we'll forgive them. Amen? Amen to that? No matter what they do, right? If they go to prison, we go and visit. If they got into an accident because of stupidity or whatever the reason was, we go to the hospital. We are there always, whether it was good or bad. And so what Matthew is trying to teach us, that this is what we need to do also for the community members. We are responsible for it. The sin that I do, that I commit, is not my individual sin that does not affect the rest of the community. My sins affect all of us. And if Matt wants to come and rebuke me of my sins, he is allowed to. As long as he does it with love. As long as he is not judging. As long as he is teaching me by his example of life. What do you mean, Father? Well, remember when we told our children not to drink? Yes? Remember that? How do we taught them better not to drink any alcohol or spirits? By not drinking ourselves, by not having anything in our homes. Right? So we teach by example. That is our authority. That is our moral character. We have no authority whatsoever if we think that we're teaching only by words or by punishment. And this is not what the gospel is saying. Correct? And my sins are not individual. It affects the whole community. Let me give an example. About years ago, I worked in a church and I was an assistant of the church. And the priest was an alcoholic. I knew that and they knew that. Yet nobody said anything at all for a year and a half. What they did was to restock more wine in the sacristy
And they keep their mouth shut. Until one day, that priest was so drunk, fell on the altar. We took him to the hospital, and he was having other health issues. He did not really fall because he was drunk. He fell because the alcohol was making more things happening in his body. He ended up leaving the church, and as he was going into the church, we learned by being by ourselves that there was a money embellishment issue as well. What would have stopped that priest for doing so? By speaking out. It's a disease, right? It's not a sin, but it's a disease. Maybe it's sinful that he was doing that to himself. Yes, but we are responsible for it, right? Somebody should say something. Somebody should have sat down with him in love, in love, in love. Not judging. That is one of the issues that we have in the church. If we keep silence, we are just as sinners as the other ones are. And our sin is greater. Amen?